Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Malloy, and this is lecture number 2A, Southeast Asia, and this corresponds roughly to pages 265 to 280 of your text. All right, well, we've already learned a little bit about the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca has made throughout history Southeast Asia an important world trading network, or part of an important world trading network, and it remains a vital world trade center even today. The Strait of Malacca allowed traders to connect the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and by the 1500s, Europeans were competing with each other for control of this vital trade center. Well, when did the Europeans arrive in Southeast Asia? I've already told you in prior lectures that it's going to get colonized by the Europeans. Well, Southeast Asians had been trading with the Arab world for centuries, introducing Southeast Asia to new products from the Western world, as well as to Islam, the belief system. Well, Europeans began exploration of Southeast Asia beginning in the 1500s during the European Age of Old Imperialism. We already know that the age of European Old Imperialism was based in part on the concept of God, gold, and glory. And we know that it lasted from around the 1500s until the late 1700s. It was the type of imperialism before industrialization. And that's important to remember because there have been two ages of imperialism, old imperialism and new imperialism. Well, I'm going to first talk about the age of old imperialism and how it related to Southeast Asia. Okay? All right, so we've already learned this year that the age of old imperialism began with Spanish and Portuguese domination and colonization during the 1500s. For years, European explorers searched for a quicker route to the Spice Islands in the east, leading to the colonization of North and South America. Notable explorers included Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was the first European to reach India by sailing around Africa in 1498. Well, da Gama then pushed further east, capturing Malacca in 1511. The Europeans began calling the islands around the Strait of Malacca the East Indies. Following the Portuguese trade network in the 1500s, the Dutch began trading and colonizing the region in the late 1500s. Much of Indonesia was controlled by the Dutch. The Dutch managed to take Malacca from the Portuguese in 1641. The Dutch dominated the region during the 17 and 1800s, and then they really colonized it. The Dutch set up plantations that grew cash crops like coffee throughout the region. The Dutch created what eventually became known as the Dutch culture system during the 1800s. Under the culture system, the Dutch required villages to set aside about 1/5 of their crops and land for Dutch use in cash crop production. And then they were required to sell it back to the Dutch at artificially low prices, set by the Dutch, of course. This was great for the Dutch in terms of making a profit, but not so great for the people doing all of the work. The Dutch would turn around and sell these crops at much higher prices, making a huge profit on the world market. The Dutch often required the same amount of crops from the locals, even in times of drought or other disasters. This often led to mass suffering of the people, like famine. During the 17 and 1800s, European influence in Southeast Asia grew, as demand for cash crops like coffee and tea increased throughout Europe. Well, during the 1800s, the British gained control of another part of Southeast Asia, the Malayan Peninsula. Eventually, the British took control of the Dutch territory, including Malacca. By the 1890s, Britain was colonizing much of Southeast Asia during the period of new imperialism. Now, we've already learned that new imperialism refers to the type of imperialism that took place following the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The focus was more about opening up marketplaces around the globe during this age. The British dominated the age of new imperialism, building up the most powerful empire in the world by 1914. Remember the colonization of India that we talked about earlier in the year? Yeah, remember the quote, "The sun never sets on the British Empire"? And how about the devilfish cartoon from class? Both of these surely demonstrate that the British dominated that part of the world, or the world at that time. The British purchased another territory called Singapore from a king or sultan who ruled the area. This became a major center for British trade in Southeast Asia. Pretty soon, there was a scramble for colonies in Southeast Asia amongst the European powers of the time. This was very similar to the whole scramble for Africa that we learned about during our Africa unit this year. Other British colonies included Burma, or what we now call Myanmar. Burma bordered British-controlled India. Consequently, there are still many remnants of British influence in Myanmar today. Other nations who heavily infiltrated Southeast Asia, establishing colonies, include France. France established a massive territory that was called French Indochina. It included nations like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. There are still French influences in these countries even today, especially like bread and stuff. French missionaries also introduced Catholicism to that part of the world. A French missionary also helped the Vietnamese create their own Western alphabet to replace, well, he didn't create the Western alphabet, but rather he introduced a Western alphabet to replace the Chinese character system and to use to represent the Vietnamese language. This alphabet is called Quoc Nu. By the 1880s, Vietnam was part of the French colonial empire. Both Cambodia and Laos were part of French Indochina. They became protectorates of France. Now, the word protect is in the word protectorate, so that should think of maybe, oh, they're protecting them? Well, sort of. Okay, a protectorate is a country that's allowed by a colonizing power to keep its own government by its own people. However, the colonizing government, okay, they are in charge of maybe telling the local government how they're allowed to rule policy-wise. Okay, so it's technically when a local government is directed policy-wise by an outside nation or colonizing nation. All right, another country that we're going to talk about today is Thailand. See, Thailand was really the only Southeast Asian nation to escape European rule. Instead, King Mongkut, a famous Thai king, he prevented European colonization by modernizing his nation, by signing peace treaties with European powers. This is very important to remember because really it's the only nation that did not get colonized in Southeast Asia. Thailand was the exception, okay? All right, and also King and I. That should help you remember this, okay? King and I. Watch the movie, it's actually great. All right, other Southeast Asian nations that were colonized included the Philippines, which came under Spanish rule during the 1500s. Like many Spanish colonies, the Spanish set up something called the Encomienda system there. Encomienda was basically the right to demand taxes and labor from the local population. It's basically slavery, although on paper it was supposed to help local populations by providing them with education and religious instruction. Well, by the 1600s, the Spanish ruled completely over the Philippines. By the 1890s, the Filipinos rebelled against Spanish rule, due to rising nationalism in European colonies around the globe. We've already learned about nationalist leaders like Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, remember? And also Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. We know that no one likes to be ruled by a foreign power, and eventually they're going to demand independence. We saw earlier this year how many nations in Africa gained their independence due to nationalism leading up to and following World War II. Nationalist leaders in Africa promoted nationalistic movements like Pan-Africanism, remember that? In which charismatic leaders encouraged revolt against European control, and they promoted concepts like self-determination, which means the right to rule one's own nation. Well, Filipino nationalism was promoted by Emilio Aguinaldo, who assisted the U.S. against the Spanish in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. Although the combined forces helped rid the Philippines of Spanish rule, it resulted in the U.S. making the Philippines its own territory. This led to even more hatred of foreign rule within the Philippines and more rebellion. And if you recall the Spanish-American War that you studied back in 8th grade, this is what we're talking about, okay? All right, well, although the Americans did implement many good changes in the Philippines, like the creation of hospitals and schools, most Filipinos lived in poverty. The Philippines did not receive their independence didn't receive their independence until July 4th, 1946. Although now they celebrate their Independence Day on June 12th of each year to reflect their own cultural history and the date Emiliano Aguinaldo declared independence. All right, well, Filipinos still face many challenges under self-rule, including ethnic and Cold War conflicts. During the Cold War era, communists in the Philippines, called Huks, fought for control of the nation in a series of revolutions and rebellions. And so, of course, as the U.S., we had to get involved because it was a Cold War conflict. The U.S. provided military support for the Philippines during these insurrections. Then, from 1965 to 1986, the U.S. supported a dictator in the Philippines named Ferdinand Marcos. Although he was popular at first, establishing many anti-poverty programs, it became quickly clear that he was pocketing much of the nation's wealth, or at least using it for his own benefit. For instance, Marcos's wife, Imelda, evidently had thousands and thousands of designer shoes. Marcos established, eventually, martial law in the Philippines, which is supposed to be temporary rule by the military. This lasted until 1981, and it helped to suppress political opponents who called for free elections. One of those opponents was a man named Benigno Aquino, and I'm probably mispronouncing it, I'm sorry. Benigno Aquino was murdered by supporters of Marcos in 1983. Aquino's death set off massive protests in the Philippines. Marcos was forced to hold free elections in 1986. The widow of Aquino was Corazon Aquino, who would become the new president. The Philippines continue to face challenges today, including, recently, Typhoon Haiyian in November 2013, which killed thousands of people. Other challenges in the Philippines include threats by Islamic terrorist group and militants post-September 11th, 2001. All right, but more later. Thanks for listening. Bye.